Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Amber from Mayan Riviera Properties in Puerto Morelos, Mexico, and I'm going to be hosting your workshop this evening. If you're not familiar with Puerto Morelos, we are just south of Cancun in the state of Quintana Roo, Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. So I know most of you have probably heard of Cancun, and we're just south of there, just about 15 minutes south of the Cancun airport. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the workshop. The first thing I'm going to cover is a brief introduction, and then we're going to get right into the topics about selling your property in Mexico. This is a little bit about our company, Mayan Riviera Properties. I established Mayan Riviera Properties in 2006. We are AMPI Realtors. That means we belong to AMPI, which is the National Association of Realtors in Mexico. And so the logo for AMPI is this here. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Amber from Mayan Riviera Properties in Puerto Morelos, Mexico, and I'll be hosting the workshop this evening. If you don't know where Puerto Morelos is, we are just south of Cancun. We're about 15 minutes south of the Cancun airport in the state of Quintana Roo, Mexico, out in the Yucatan Peninsula. So if you haven't heard of Puerto, I'm sure you have heard of Cancun, and you'll easily be able to find us that way. I really enjoy living here. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. We're going to start with a little brief introduction and then get right into the material about selling your Mexican property. A little bit about our company, Mayan Riviera Properties. You can see our Mayan Riviera Properties logo down here in the bottom left-hand corner. That's our company. I established Mayan Riviera Properties in 2006. We are AMPI Realtors. If you're not familiar with the organization AMPI, that's the National Real Estate Association in Mexico, and I've included their logo over here in the top right. We'll talk about these organizations a little bit more in a moment, but we are a member of AMPI. We're also an international member of NAR. NAR is this blue R that those of you in the U.S. are probably familiar with seeing. That's the U.S. National Realtors Association, and we are international members of that organization as well. In addition to those memberships, I'm also a federally certified broker by Conocer, and Conocer is a Mexican entity that certifies various professional trades. And I am federally certified in real estate sales and also real estate sales and tourist zones through Conocer. And just so you're familiar with these logos, in the case that you're looking at different realty offices, Conocer's logo is this one, as I mentioned, and then this one at the bottom says Profesional Inmobiliario Certificado, and that means that I'm a professional real estate agent that's been certified. And so these bottom two are basically referring to the same thing, but I wanted to introduce you to them in case you came across them in your search for a realtor. We are the only AMPI office in Puerto Morelos, and we specialize in Puerto Morelos. If I receive clients that might be interested in Cancun or Playa del Carmen, nearby cities, I refer them to specialists in that area. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why that's important when you're looking for a realtor. We have a really prominent office location in Puerto Morelos. We're right in the middle of the town square, oceanfront. It's a two-story sort of turquoise-colored building. Please stop in and say hi. And we have an excellent reputation for being professional, knowledgeable, and ethical, which is a good reputation to have if you are a real estate agency. This is me. I'm Amber Pierce-Schulz, and I'm originally from Michigan. I graduated from Michigan State University, and I've been visiting Puerto Morelos since 1998. I made the leap and began living there full-time in 2004, and I'm the co-owner and broker at Mayan Riviera Properties. This is Kim. She's not with us tonight, but I wanted you to be able to put a face with her name in case you did contact the office. She is an agent that works at our office in sales, so you might very well be talking with Kim if you contact us. She's originally from Colorado and a graduate of the University of Colorado School of Law. She practiced law in Colorado for 20 years and began visiting Puerto Morelos in 1999. And like a lot of us, Puerto Morelos sucked her in, and so she bought a family home in 2005 and finally moved to Puerto Morelos full-time in 2012. She is also federally certified in real estate sales and tourist zones. So I just wanted to give that brief intro in case you contact us after the the workshop, which you're welcome to do, I'll have my contact information at the end. You'll be able to put some faces with names. These are the topics that we're going to cover tonight. What to look for in a real estate agent, the types of real estate listings that you'll find available to you and your property in Mexico in general, your realtor's marketing program. We'll talk a little bit about what you should expect out of that. Listing your property, what's that process look like? The required paperwork you're going to need for your property in order to complete a listing with an agency. The showing process, how does that work? The sales process, we're going to walk you through that so you are comfortable with what's going to be happening. And while we talk about the sales process, we'll also address some details in particular. Those are escrow accounts, how we deal with properties that include contents, if your house is selling, fully or partially furnished, and then costs associated with selling. Part of the cost associated with selling is the famous ISR, which is the next point. ISR is that capital gains tax that people have lots of questions about, and so we'll be talking at length about ISR tonight. And then I'd like to wrap up the workshop with just a few tips that we have for your successful sale. As we get started, within some of these topics, I'm going to talk about how we operate here in our office. And I realize that everybody joining us isn't necessarily from our area or going to be using our agency. But I still think it's relevant information because the way we operate is pretty much according to, industry standard and best practices in real estate offices. So even if you are going to be listing with another realty office, you should expect the same concepts to apply, similar services to be offered. And you can use what we're covering tonight to compare and contrast the offices that you're interested in speaking with. First up tonight on the topic is the topic of what to look for in a real estate agent. And frankly, Mexico is evolving in a lot of different ways. It's modernizing many of its systems and its culture in general. One of the areas that is modernizing is the profession of real estate agency. At this point, not all states require licensing. As a matter of fact, our state, Quintana Roo, required no licensing or requirements in order for a realtor to open an office. Anybody was able to hang a shingle. That changed in 2014. This year, the state of Quintana Roo passed a licensing requirement law, and I believe now we're up to, 11 states in Mexico that now have these laws. In Quintana Roo, we're currently awaiting the requirements under the law. They're establishing the framework of how us as agents can receive this license, so none of us have it yet, but you can expect that if you're looking to list in Quintana Roo that your agency should be licensed in the near future. So if you are operating in a state that doesn't require licensing, although a lot of states, again, are moving toward that model, and I think it's just a matter of time at this point, but if you aren't, how do you know, that your agent is a real professional? Because there's certainly a lot of people, a lot of, air quote agents out there that we wouldn't necessarily send you to and be confident that you're in good hands. So here's things that I think you can look for in an agency in order to know that you're going to be taken care of. Number one is that AMPI membership. We talked about AMPI just a moment ago. That's the National Association of Realtors in Mexico. And if that realtor is a member of AMPI, frankly, I don't know how you could practice real estate in Mexico and not be a member of the National Real Estate Organization. It just seems sort of logical to me that if you're serious about selling real estate, you'd be a member. There's a code of ethics that you have to adhere to. You are peer reviewed. You receive lots of opportunities for continuing education and regular industry updates, which are important because, processes, laws, and things are changing and modernizing. Just like our professional industry of real estate laws are also updating regularly, and it's important that your agent be aware of those changes. The other thing that we have as AMPI agents is we have an MLS that we have access to, which is a multiple listing service. It's a way we promote properties in and amongst each other, and so it also gives you that advantage of having your property listed in those in that manner. Another thing, again, not a requirement, not an obligation, but certainly something that you could look for is your agent federally certified. I mentioned the organization Conocer offers federal certifications in some various areas of real estate. I happen to have 2 of those certifications. A good thing to ask. The other thing that your agent should have is experience and intimate knowledge of the area that your property is located in. And we talk a little bit more about why this is in another workshop that's about buying, living, retiring in Mexico. But suffice it to say that there are no public records of property sales in Mexico. There is no public record that the MLS system pulls from to give you comparables and things like that. So if your agent isn't working in the area that your property is in, they're going to have absolutely no idea of what things actually sell for, the most recent sales, the most recent comparables with any real numbers. And so that is why we specialize in Puerto Morelos. I am not capable of knowing what all these condos are selling for in Playa del Carmen. Some of my colleagues are. And so, if I get interested in that area, I'm going to refer them to somebody who specializes in that area and really knows that area well to be able to guide them in listing their property or in buying a property. Does that agency have referrals available? They should be able to refer you to happy clients. Here's the other thing, it kind of gets back to, are they professionals and do they do this, as a career? And I kind of say this tongue-in-cheek. In general, companies that offer hair care, tire shop, and real estate on their sign probably aren't who you're looking for, okay? While Mexico is modernizing and it is a different country, there are some things that carry over from what you're familiar with in the real estate professionals and process in your home countries, okay? Your real estate agent ought to be able to provide you competent, comprehensive consultation. And we'll talk about that, what consultation sort of entails in the listing process. But they ought to be able to sit down with you and really be able to lead you through what's going to happen and problem solve with you. That's something you should expect. Another item that you should expect from your agent is a listing contract. That contract ought to lay out the obligations that agency has to you during the term of the contract in selling the property. Can that agent cite recent sales? Are they active in that market? What kind of activity have they had? And the other thing that you should ask, and this is a bit of a throwback to the old system, an old way of working in Mexico, and that is, ask them, do you work with other real estate professionals? Mexico has moved on from their old and inefficient model. When real estate agencies started in Mexico, they were little pop-ups that they had a few listings, and anybody that went to them, you had to go see their listings because they didn't show other people's, and so if you were buying, you had to go to all these different agencies and look at each of their individual, listings individually. That's not the way the real estate profession works anymore. Mexico has adopted the same type of model that NAR and the Canadian Realtors and the European Realtor Associations have, in that they work with other professional agencies. If you walk into my office, I not only am more than willing to show you my listings, but also the listings of all other professional agents. Benefits to sellers. Sellers, you receive a huge benefit by working with a good professional. Number one, you know that your property is going to be marketed at an appropriate price, okay? Again, that realtor is intimately aware of sales going on in your area and can provide you a really good, can be a really good guide on what's an appropriate market price. Your property is going to be promoted through effective channels. That realtor does this for a living. They have tried various outlets and know what works in their area. And so take advantage of that marketing that they have. The other thing is, this goes along with marketing. Again, realtors network and work with each other. And so you benefit from this maximum networking potential that a realtor has, in that they work with all other realtors and all of their clientele. So you really open up your property to a lot of buying power. The other thing that's really important and really, at the end of the day affects dollars and cents that you take home is we have the availability to work with some of the best notaries and real estate services to ensure that your costs are minimized and that the process works well and efficiently. So, that experience and that sort of team that we put behind us in order to get sales to come together comes from experience and comes from, a quantity of sales. And we certainly want to use that to your benefit. Now, when you go to list a property in Mexico, this might be something that's a little bit new. And again, this whole industry of real estate is transitioning into a more modern business model. But there are still some things that are, still sort of carrying over from the old system. You're going to find two types of listings. One is an open listing and one is an exclusive listing. And an open listing, again, this is another sort of what I call a throwback to the old way. This is where, because the agencies didn't work with each other, an owner would go to multiple listing agencies and market their list their property with all these different agents to market their property on their behalf. And again, this is one that's sort of going by the wayside because it's not very effective, as we're going to talk about. In this situation, each agency is really not under any obligation and is at their own discretion to market your property to the extent really of their choosing. In those circumstances, somebody might drop off information in my office and I might be happy to show a buyer if that happens to be a perfect fit for them, but I'm not obligated in any way to really promote your property. And because of that, I mentioned open listings aren't always effective because, again, I don't really have any obligation. Consider it from my perspective as a broker. If I have an exclusive listing, an owner is contracting to sell my property, sell their, an owner's property, and be their designated agent in that process for a particular period of time. I know as a broker I have a good chance of selling that property, and therefore I'm going to invest time and money into promoting it, okay? Because we know that we're going to be involved in the sale. In an open listing, I don't really feel very motivated to put a bunch of money into promotion and efforts into promotion when I'm not necessarily guaranteed to be a part of the sale process. And so because of that, owners end up with very limited advertising, again, because nobody's going to invest and pay for something that they're not necessarily going to be a part of. The property has multiple listings that gets put up at multiple prices because the owner kind of loses control over that multiple listing service. And that ultimately erodes buyer confidence. If I have a buyer, one of the biggest obstacles we overcome sometimes with buyers in Mexico is, giving them confidence in the system, doing lots of education through workshops like these, talking about how the real estate market really works, how ownership really works, and then they go online and they start looking for properties because they might be interested in some, doing some search, and they send me stuff and go, well, why is this house in 3 different prices? And I've been in the situation where they've sent me a house and the owner's really asking $300,000 and somebody's got it listed for $250,000, and it's very hard to convince a buyer that the house was never at $250,000. I have no idea where that price came from. The buyer really, it just erodes the confidence and the quality of the transaction, and oftentimes those properties, those buyers just aren't interested in proceeding. The whole situation just kind of looks flaky or shady, Again, because you have all these different agencies advertising it, nobody puts up a particular sign on the property, or the alternate happens and you've got one property with 10 signs and that looks equally as ridiculous and ineffective. There's a lack of consultation and market analysis. We'll talk about what we do with exclusive listings in a moment when we talk about the listing process, but without that, a lot of times these properties get overpriced, or the paperwork isn't in order necessarily to sell quickly, and therefore agents that might have a buyer aren't real motivated to check out the property. So for all of these reasons, I find that most of these open listings overall have a diminished credibility, and frankly, nobody's very successful at selling them. I'm not extremely motivated to sell them as a broker, and if I do have a buyer, typically everything's kind of in disarray a lot of times, and it just isn't worth the effort. We can find them other places that are ready to sell. So it just doesn't work out very often, with the exception of some rare circumstances. In this particular situation, if you do choose to go this route, each agency is going to register their clients with you as an owner, and you're responsible to keep all of those agents informed of price changes, or if the property goes off the market. You're responsible for coordinating all your own showings because there isn't a central agency doing that for you. So you've got twice as much work. You have not nearly the effective marketing program that you have. You're really not doing yourselves any favors, and you're making a lot of work for yourself in the end. The other thing is that this becomes a big component. If somebody wants to do an open listing with me and I'm not completely confident that they are going to keep me 100% appraised of any price changes Or heaven forbid I get a buyer interested and they fly down and we go to look at this property and I find out the property went under contract 2 weeks ago and nobody ever told me. That's a huge issue. So for those reasons, we just really don't work with a lot of open listings. There's a rare exception here or there, but for the most part, it's just not it's not worth the aggravation, and in the end, they don't end up selling anyway. So it's a lot of effort for nothing. Moving to exclusive listings, this is really what the model is moving toward in the real estate industry in Mexico, and it's one that's been adopted by the U.S. and Canada and Europe, and one that you're most familiar with. In this case, an owner contracts a particular listing agent, and that agent is going to represent you and your interest in the sale process. And these listings are going to be promoted according to the agency's marketing program. Okay? Now that does not mean, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, that we only sell it within our office. You know, we network with other agencies and we sell their listings and they sell our listings, and so you're really not cutting out any of the marketing potential of your property by doing that. You know, you still have all the agents working for you, and in the end, they're actually more motivated because they know that an agent has went through and you've got your paperwork in order, and they know their clients are getting registered, and they know, you know, so things are just far more organized and user friendly for an agent if they're working with another agency. So again, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but because these listings then all go through a listing process with a professional agent, it means that the buyer agent can rest assured that, you know, their property is, you know, their buyers are going to be taken care of, and they're looking at a property that sort of met some criteria before it got listed. This is our marketing program for our exclusive listings. So if you're interested in being a client at Mayan Riviera, this is what you can expect. Again, this is something that you can use for compare and contrast if you're looking elsewhere. Our exclusive listings are marketed on our website. They're promoted through our blog. Our blog is portomorelosblog.com. That'll be at the link will be at the contact at the very end of this program. That blog is where we send people who are interested in real estate in Puerto Morelos. Subscribe to the blog. We post all new listings, price changes, sales, so people that want to keep tabs on the real estate industry, subscribe to the blog if they've expressed interest in that in Puerto Morelos. We also post articles about living in Mexico, law changes, things that affect expats that live here full-time or part-time. And we also post a little bit about Puerto Morelos. So if you're interested in the blog for any of those reasons, feel free to subscribe. We also have a social media marketing program with Twitter and Facebook and Google+, and of course it gets put into that mill as well. Every listing that we have gets a video that's a virtual showing. So, you know, pictures only do so much. We found a really effective marketing tool is this virtual showing video. We show the house. You know, buyers can be sitting in their living room at home in a different country and looking at a house, seeing the neighborhood, seeing the house, walking through the house as if I were giving them a showing of the house and yard and things like that, so you really get a feel for how the property lays out and the surroundings and the area, etc. They've been really great. Of course, YouTube is another form of social media. It's on our YouTube channel, and that video is there, and then it's also embedded in your listings page on our website. There are also, you know, again, that networking, you know, is pure marketing that we do with other real estate agencies. We feature your properties in the promotions that we send to other realtors. We also have a very successful referral program with other realtors. I can refer them clientele and vice versa. So that works out, and we all work together to get your property sold. It's listed in the national MLS database because we are members of AMPI, and it's also because we're international members of NAR, it also gets listed on Realtor.com, which is the U.S. Realtors Association's website, in an international properties section, and that gets a really good Google search result, and so that's a great way, a great marketing tool that we have. Of course, you're in all of our in-office promotions, the TV screens and listing sheets and things that people can pick up in the office. We pay for advertising on other listing sites. When you sell international property, the biggest source of your initial interest are either people walking in the door because they love Puerto Morelos and they have to live there, or people that find you online. And so we pay to have your property posted on some sites that we found to be effective in generating traffic. online that way. We advertise in our local tourist guides, and then we always are at sponsoring towns events and festivals and setting up booths and just more exposure that way. And we get to meet a lot of great people that way and answer a lot of questions. A really effective marketing tool for us has been the weekly online workshops. Weekly workshops through our office. So in the high season, once a week, we do workshops in our office about how to buy in Mexico. Those workshops are free, and lots of people stop in and to learn about how that works. And then we do online workshops similar to this, at least once a year, sometimes a couple of times a year. And those workshops are about how to buy in Mexico as well. And then, of course, we place our signage on your property so that anybody going by knows that it's for sale and has a way to contact us. Okay, so we're going to talk about listing your property. This is how to get started. This is the listing process that you're going to go through with an exclusive listing with a realtor, okay? The listing process is an immense amount of paperwork and legwork and effort on the front end. But we want to make sure that you and your property are prepared to sell, that you understand the process, you know what's going in, and you're prepared to listen to offers. To do that, we do a lot of different things. The first thing we do is we're going to sign a listing contract. Our listing contract happens to be in English and in Spanish, so that our foreign property owners can read our contracts well. Our listings, of course, we're going to take photos of that property. We're going to take the video, the virtual walkthrough that we mentioned. We're going to take extensive property information from you so that we can try to answer any questions that we can foresee buyers asking. That also eliminates us having to bother you a lot with questions during the showing process. We are going to take a rental history from you. If we're promoting your property as a vacation rental, then clearly people are going to ask about its rental history, and so we'll go ahead and get that from you. We're also going to need an inventory if your property is being sold partially or fully furnished, what that means, what an inventory of what that includes or excludes from the sale, and of course keys for showing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to review your paperwork, and we're going to make sure that our properties are ready to close. We look through paperwork, we look for certain things to make sure everything is there and that everything appears to be okay. We try to do that to sort of thwart off any issues or delays as we would go to closing. And that's a huge advantage over some of these for sale by owner efforts where people just aren't familiar with their paperwork and they don't really have a lot to get together, and then it becomes a big delay at close. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, so I'm not going to get too much into this now, but the review of paperwork might be more extensive if you've constructed your home or added on to your home. A lot of times we find that is where some of the issues with paperwork ends up coming up at closing, and so we might have to have an attorney review your paperwork and make sure that you've got everything ready to go. The last big part of what we do, and this is essential in what we do, is we provide you an ISR estimate. That's your capital gains tax, okay? And for you to be prepared as a seller to entertain any kind of offer, I don't know how you would be able to, respond, accepting, declining, or countering if you don't know what you're looking at as a tax liability. So because of that, we provide an estimate so you know, and you can go into any negotiations prepared with what your bottom line is. Now we're going to talk about some of the required paperwork that we need, okay? Please note, this list is for privately owned properties. So if you have a privately owned property, this list will be fairly inclusive of what you're going to need. Individual circumstances sometimes dictate that we need other things, but for the most part, this is what we're going to need from you in order to list your property. Again, this is for privately held properties. If you own your property in a Mexican corporation, or if you own your property in a trust, but that trust primary beneficiary is an LLC or some type of foreign corporation, then there are additional paperwork requirements. And so this list is not going to be all-inclusive in those circumstances, and you need to contact us so that we can get you the full list of everything that you're going to need, because we're going to need corporate documents and some things like that. And so the list will be different. But this refers to either properties held in a deed or properties held via trust, where Mr. Smith or Mr. and Mrs. Smith are the listed owners or beneficiaries of the trust. Okay? So First up on the list is personal documents. We need these for each owner. So if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are on the deed, or Mr. and Mrs. Smith are the beneficiaries in the trust, we're going to need these documents for both persons. First, if you're a foreigner, we need a passport. Okay, that's a requirement. If you are a Mexican national, then we would take either your Mexican passport or your IFE. Have to have those. Then, if you have any of the following documentation, we'll also take that, and this might play into the potential for some tax reduction down the line. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Your visa. If you have a Mexican visa, be it resident permanente, which is permanent, or temporal, temporary, we need copies of that. If you have your visa, then you also have your CURP. It's on your visa, so we'll have that. And then once you have your visa and CURP, you can also apply for an RFC, which is a tax ID number. And so if you have that, we'll also need that. Here's just an idea of what these visas look like, just in case you don't know. This is mine. I'm a residente permanente. You can see that up in the top. And this is my CURP. So if you go to look for your CURP, it's right there on your visa. It's a number similar to a Social Security number, not quite the same. But it's a national ID number that you have. And so it's right there on your visa. Now, this gentleman was on the immigration website. It's not the greatest picture, but it is a picture of a temporary visa. You can see it says Residente Temporal at the top, and again, here is his CURP right here. They blanked it out, but that's his CURP. A quick note about CURPs that I personally ran into, and we've had some other sellers run into, at least through our immigration office. Each one of these letters in this CURP number means something, and this letter right here in particular is either going to be an H for hombre, which means man, or M for mujer, which means woman. It identifies your sex. And I never paid attention to mine, and I had a notary point out that unless I'd had some serious changes in life, I was not a man, and I needed to go back to immigration and have them update my CURP, because immigration issues this CURP number for foreigners. So if yours is not correct, if you happen to look and yours isn't correct, go back to immigration and have them fix that, because you should either be an H or an M accordingly. Now, this is paperwork that's required for properties, okay? Before I get into the list, remember that this is the list, the paperwork that's going to be required to list your property with an agency, okay? And it allows us to check out a number of things to make sure your paperwork's correct, it's complete, and it's ready to send to a notary at the time of sale. It also allows us, should there be an offer accepted, to present this basic property portfolio of information to a notary without having to track you down and have delays in scanning and emailing or FedExing to our office. So it's just a lot more efficient to collect this stuff all up front and make sure we're 100% a go. Now, what I don't want you to think is that this is the entire documentation needed to close, because it's not. The notary is going to have other documents that he's going to need to solicit through his offices. Generally, this is everything that you'll need to provide in most circumstances. But the notary is going to solicit some other things, like a certificate of no liens and some other documentation, but that stuff is time sensitive. For instance, a certificate of no liens is only good for 30 days. So that's stuff that, those are items that the notary is going to solicit at the time of closing. But this is probably all that you'll ever have to provide toward closing on your property. First item on the list is your deed or your bank trust deed, and that's called an escritura with boleto de registro. Okay? If you are not aware of what those two items are, the escritura and the boleto de registro, in my next slide I'm going to show you what those are. Okay? Next thing is your property tax, a current property tax receipt. It's called predial in Spanish. If your property is beachfront, then we need a copy of your beach tax payment, which is called SOFAMAT. If your property is beachfront and you happen to have your beach concession, then copies of your beach concession paperwork we'd also put in that file, because that needs to be transferred to the new owners. A water bill, that needs to go into the pile of paperwork. Electric bill, any other utilities that could transfer. This happens because let's say you have Sky Satellite and you're advertising Sky Satellite and your house is fully booked through the high season with vacation guests. Well, if somebody buys, they need to continue that service, and it's not something they're going to want to cancel and take out and reinstall. They're going to just transfer that into their name, so there's not an interruption for guests. And so any of those types of things, if you have them, we'll get copies of the bills so that we can go ahead and get working on those transfers of services. if and when you sell. So rental history, if it's available, we're going to need your rental history. If you're selling a property that's just raw land, it's a lot, then we're going to need a document called a Constancia de Uso de Suelo. And that document is the zoning document from your municipality, and it allows a buyer to know what they can build, how many square meters, how tall they can build, what their setbacks are. And so if you have a lot, we require this document because clearly those are questions that a buyer is going to have and going to need to know. So we request that document. If your property has title insurance, if you bought a title insurance property when you purchased or since the time of purchase, we'd love to have a copy of that certificate. We can share that with buyers to let them know the property has an existing title insurance policy. Now the other two items are not, the last two items on this list, they're not necessarily paperwork that we need, but it's more of a heads up. We need to know, if you are in a condo or in a homeowners association of some sort, are your HOA fees paid to date? We need to know that because prior to closing, the notary is going to require a letter from the condo or HOA admin saying that your fees have been paid in full. The other question we have is your fideicomiso paid to date? It needs to be paid up to date because when we go to start the closing process, we've got an offer that's been agreed upon. The bank is not going to budge and going to move this process until they have been paid in full for their back fees. So we need to know those two things right up front. Now when you look over this list, I mentioned at the bottom, the docs in blue, so any documents that I listed in blue are required by the notary. Okay, that's part of the information that we have to provide to the notary to get started in the due diligence process of closing. The documents in black are required by us. Okay? And basically, any document that has a name on it, property taxes, bills, etc., you'll notice those have asterisks, and that's because they all need to be in a current owner's name. If it's Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the water can bill be in Mr. Smith's, or the electric bill can be in Mrs. Smith's. It doesn't have to be in both, but it at least has to be in a listed owner's name. For those of you that don't know what your escritura with boleto de registro looks like, this is this document, okay, and we're going to go through it. To back up a little bit and so that you understand, at your closing, when you purchased your property, your notary that day provided you a provisional copy of this paperwork that you signed, okay? And after he submitted the paperwork, after closing day, he took that paperwork and he submitted it to the public registry, and the public registry then recorded the sale. So between 30 to 90 days after closing, your notary got back and should have given to you, or your agent would have given to you, a full copy of your escritura along the boleta de registro. And we'll see what those documents look like in just a moment. The boleta de registro basically shows that the property was registered in the public registry. And so if you only have the provisional copy of what you signed, you are not going to have proof that your transaction was ever registered in the public registry. Okay? So you want to have the full copy. The full copy is going to have your escritura, which we'll see, the boleto de registro from your public registry, and then also a bunch of addendums in the back of all of the documentation that was present at the time of closing. All these IDs and papers that I requested, that all gets copied and put into the back as addendums. Okay, so it's a huge document. All I really need is the escritura and the boleto de registro, which we'll see here. This is a escritura, okay? Note that at the top it says instrumento, numero, and then there's a yellow square where that number would go. That is instrument number such and such. So every title has a number, and that number is right here. That number will come into play here in just a moment. But your deed is numbered, and the number is listed at the top. This is the first page of an escritura. These escrituras can be quite long. They can be, 10 to 20 pages long sometimes. But this is the first page. You'll see that it has a seal up at the top. Obviously, this is a black and white copy, but there's a seal up at the top showing that it was from the notary's office. Moving to the very last page of this deed, you'll find the notary's signature at the bottom along with another seal. Every page gets stamped. And so if you have the notary's signature down at the bottom, then you have a copy of the actual escritura and not necessarily the provisional copy that was provided to you with just the text of the document the day of closing. Now this is a boleta de registro. Okay, here's the boleta de registro. And the boleta de registro Again, what this shows is that the documentation was taken from the notary's office and registered in your public registry. Okay, now this happens to be from the public registry in Benito Juarez of the state of Quintana Roo. Perhaps in other states they might look a little different, but they should contain the same content. I'm going to move this over here. Remember that I said that there was this yellow box with your deed number. The deed number will say, would also be contained right here so that you know that this document corresponds with this document. It basically says that this is the Boleta de Registro for deed number such and such, and in our public registry it has this electronic folio number, which we have in green, okay? And that's the information that we're looking for. Now, if you purchased a property, I'm going to go back. If you purchased a property, at least in Quintana Roo, probably 12 years ago or more, your Boleta de Registro is not a separate sheet of paper, as you see here. Your Boleta de Registro is actually a big stamp underneath the notary's signature with a bunch of public registry information on it. And that's fine. There's an update that needs to be done because they moved to electronic filing systems, and we need to get your system into that into the electronic system with a file number. But it's fine if you don't have a Boleta de Registro and you have this that seal at the bottom. That's fine. We can work with that, and we just need to get your paperwork updated at the public registry with the electronic file number. But if you don't have either, then what you're looking at is a provisional copy, and it's not the full copy of your deed. Okay? Required paperwork for new construction. This is where we find at our office is the biggest reason that people's paperwork isn't complete, and it delays listing properties because we need to get it completed. When you purchased your property, in the deed it recorded the actual size of construction. Let's say you had 100 square meters of construction on your property when you bought. Then your deed would say, this deed was purchased by Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and it's at this and this address, et cetera, and it has 100 square meters of construction. Then, or maybe you bought a lot and it had nothing, okay? Well, if you built new construction on your property or enlarged existing construction, so in other words, if you added square meters of construction to your property to the amount that was originally recorded in the deed when you purchased, then that construction needs to be registered. Now, here's where we find the discrepancies, because usually what happens is local builders typically give you this pile of paperwork and you guys are really good about filing it away, but you have to take that paperwork and go get it registered. And so this is where sometimes we see a discrepancy, okay? Ideally, it was registered at the time of construction, all right? And how we check your paperwork is this. The number of square meters of construction should match, first of all, the physical construction that exists on your property. So if you have 200 square meters of actual construction sitting on your property, then 200 square meters should also be the amount listed in your cedula catastral. And your cedula catastral, we'll see that document in just a moment. I have an example in the next slide, but that's your official tax certificate from Catastro, the tax office. And so, if you have 200 square meters physically sitting on your land, then you should have 200 square meters being taxed as taxable construction in your tax certificate. Okay? Now the third piece of the pie is that also should be the amount that's listed in your deed. If you've had your deed rectified, it's called a rectification, you can go back and say, hey, I constructed property and now I'm Mr. and Mrs. Smith and we no longer own 100 square meters of construction, we now own 200. You can have the deed rectified. That's something that if you want your paperwork perfect and you choose to do that, great. If not, this is not a deal breaker, because at the point when you go to sell, provided that number 1 and number 2 match, that can be amended at the time of sale. So the document that the notary drafts for the buy-sell can include an act in it that says Mr. and Mrs. Smith did construct on the property, they've added 100 square meters, therefore their property is a total of 200 square meters of construction, and then second act, now we're going to sell the 200 square meters of construction and plus the land to the following people. Okay? It's fine to do that as long as you know that your paperwork, the point is to fix at least up to point number 2 as soon as possible. Okay? Number 3 can wait till a sale as long as you're comfortable that number 1 and 2 are correct. Okay? You do have to pay to have it rectified, and you're either going to have to pay to have it adjusted at the time of sale or or if you choose to do the rectification and you're not listing your property. Either way, there's a fee, a processing fee, but either way, it's okay. So this becomes complicated, and this is why, and this is certainly outside the scope of what we do. There are attorneys that audit this stuff and make sure that it's complete, and if it's not, can go back in the process and figure out where sort of the train left the tracks. Here's what happens when you build. When you build, you get permits done, or you get blueprints done, and those blueprints are taken to the city, and the city has an engineer that stamps them and approves them and says, yes, they meet our requirements. And then you get permits for your construction license, okay? And then you start to build, and you're building what's on your blueprints, and then an inspector comes out, and they make sure that you're building what you've said you're going to do according to the blueprints that they approved. And he continues out, and you have to get other things, other permits, and you have to pay your workers Seguro Social and all of those types of things. And then at the very end, if you've jumped through all the hoops correctly, you get what's called a terminación de obra. And a terminación de obra literally means the finishing of construction. And so it's like an occupancy permit. And it says, according to I received this paper because I jumped through all the hoops correctly during the construction process, okay? What happens then is that the terminación de obra, at least in the municipio of Benito Juarez, it may be different in other places, I'm not aware, but at least there, here, you have to take that terminación de obra from the municipality construction licensing zoning offices, it's issued there, and take it over to the tax office and say, hey, I have finished my construction, and therefore I need you to add this amount of construction to the taxable value of my property, okay? So if you have a terminación de obra, but your cédula catastral doesn't match, you've missed that step. You've missed taking it in and getting the construction added, okay? If you don't have a terminación de obra, then that can be a big can of worms because it just depends on where the train derailed as to how far you have to go back and what you're going to have to do to fix it. And so this is something that an attorney needs to look at, okay? This is a cédula catastral, all right? A cédula catastral, you can see it's labeled up at the top. A couple things I want to point out. Notice it says condition, en funcionamiento, okay? That means it's functioning. If it was saying it was under construction or it was raw land and you have a house, then you have a problem, okay? This is a functioning property. If it says it's under construction, that means somebody pulled a construction permit and they noted that, and then nobody ever went and closed it out by showing them a terminación de obra, okay? It'll give you the address and the name. Typically, if you own the property in fideicomiso, your bank name may be here rather than your personal names. Now this is a condo, so it doesn't have it, but if it were privately owned property, it would have the meets and bounds listed here. For our purposes, this is what we're concerned with. Meters of construction, okay? If I have 200 meters of construction on my property, then I should have 200 meters of construction listed in this box. And it shows it's 4 levels. If it says 4 level, if it says 2 levels and I have 4 levels, then we've got a problem, all right? So this is a document that you can use to gauge if your construction has been registered properly. If it does, it'll at least show up here. You can then, as I said, take your deed and have it rectified if you wish, or wait and do that when you ever sell, but at least it needs to get to this point. The showing process. The showing process, we've gotten through the listing process, and I told you it was a lot, okay? We put a lot of work into the front end on the listing, but we don't want any surprises when we go to close for any parties, okay? So we've gotten through the listing process. You've signed your listing agreement. We've gotten all your paperwork. Everything's good to go. We've assigned a listing price for your your property, which is, according to market values. Your ISR liability, so you know what decisions you can make when you receive an offer. Now your property's on the market. What happens next? Well, we start showing it. We show it to, if buyers come into the office and they're interested in property and this sort of fits their bill, then we're going to arrange showings with our buyers. Also, as I mentioned, we work with other realtors, and so maybe they contact me and say, hey, Amber, I've got this person. I think, Casa Del Mar would be great, and I would like to set up a showing. In those particular circumstances, buyer agents typically have a very definite preference as to whether they want us as a listing agent on site or not during a showing, okay? And it often depends on their familiarity with the property. If they've never seen the property before, they might say, hey, would you mind going over with me and kind of showing us around? Once they've seen it, then they can do it on their own. Others really like to just work one-on-one with their clients, and that's fine with us. Those guys will often call me if they haven't seen a property before and arrange for me and them to go through it so that they're familiar with it, and then they can bring their clients back. We're happy to respect whatever those preferences are. Either way, we'll give them lots of extensive property information about the property so that they can answer questions that their buyers might have. And then we'll either be present if they wish us there, or we'll give them the keys and they'll return those keys when they're done. And that's exactly how it's handled in the States. Remember, these are professional agents and they're walking through with their clients. So just like in the States or Canada where you've got a lockbox on the door and that's how the agents with their clients get in, same thing here. If your unit is occupied, we're going to provide notice the day prior to a showing. So if you're in the house, we're going to call you the day prior and say, hey, we're going to be showing between 11 and 12 so that you know what time to go ahead and leave and what time you can come back. If you're just kind of walking around the block and killing time until we're done, we're happy to give you a call and say, hey, we're out. You're welcome to come on back to the house. If you have guests, what we do with guests, trying to contact a guest is a bit like roping the wind when they're on vacation. So what we do is we leave a note under their door the day prior, and it says, hi, we've arranged a showing. It's between 11 and noon tomorrow. Our letter, we don't want to put out your guests. They're being awfully kind to let us in, and so our letter says, you know what, don't feel like you have to leave. Although a lot of them aren't home because they're either at the beach or they're out on a tour or whatever, but don't feel like you have to leave. If they're there, a lot of times they hang out at the pool or something. It also lets them know, don't feel like you have to make any special efforts and clean or pick up. Our clients coming in understand they're looking for vacation rentals. They understand it's being rented and don't feel obligated to make any special effort. That works out really, really well, provided that the owners are advising their guests prior to check-in that they might receive a notice during their stay. The only problems I've ever had is where I show up, they don't know me from Adam, and I'm asking to walk through a house, and it's not their house, and it's their stuff inside, and they, something sounds fishy. As long as, so clearly if you're renting your house and it is for sale, you need to be able to include that in some sort of pre-arrival information or during your booking information or whatever, so that they know that Mayan Riviera Properties might be sticking a note under their door. That all being said, we try not to bother guests. If we can schedule showings on a changeover day, then we certainly do that, because we try to not impose on them if at all possible. The sales process, the offer to purchase. So let's say, we've been showing your property, now we found a buyer who's interested. That buyer is going to present an offer to purchase. That offer to purchase is going to contain the offer price, a deposit amount, and any conditions relating to the sale. If your property is being sold partially or fully furnished, it's also going to establish a value for contents that are going to be included in that sale. We will talk about this more in just a moment, so we'll get back to that point. There might be some negotiation, perhaps a counteroffer or an acceptance, whatever. Let's say we get to the point where both parties are in mutual agreement on the terms and conditions and the price, and so both parties sign. Unless there's some contingencies, which typically there aren't, unless there's some contingencies at this point, most offer to purchase will say, okay, at this point we've signed, the seller has committed to sell the property to buyers A and B, and buyers A and B are committed to buy the property from sellers A and B. Okay, everybody's committed. And in exchange for that commitment, there's going to be some things that happen. There's a good faith deposit that's going to be paid to the seller via escrow. We're going to talk about escrow accounts in a minute, but that money is going to be paid from the buyer to the seller and placed into an escrow account. And in exchange for that payment, the seller, and in signing the offer, the seller is going to remove the property from the market and commit to selling to these people. No more offers are going to be accepted. The house is off the market and moving toward closing. Then once that's happened, then the due diligence period starts. The notary typically takes 1 to 2 weeks for due diligence. In the due diligence period, he's ensuring that the title is free and clear to be transferred to the new party. Okay? Once that due diligence has passed, then he gives the nod to a fideicomiso bank if there's going to be a fideicomiso bank involved. Sometimes that fideicomiso, there are two. Sometimes it's one canceling the existing fideicomiso and another bank opening a new one. Just depends on the particular circumstances. But that's when the banks get to work. Now the banks, to open a new fideicomiso, have to solicit a permit from the Ministry of Foreign Investment. And that permit has only been taking anywhere from just a few days to a couple of weeks. Now, if you'd asked me this last year, it was taking 30 to 60 days. So for some unknown reason, they've become much, much faster at processing these permits, and I hope they keep it up. It's certainly made our closings go a lot faster. But we've seen turnaround times between a couple of days to a couple of weeks. And also during this due diligence period, your agent needs to know whether you're going to be present at closing or whether you need a power of attorney. Because if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are the sellers, Mr. and Mrs. Smith both have to be sitting in the notary's office at the day of closing unless they're being represented by a power of attorney. And a power of attorney, particularly if you aren't in Mexico at the time and it can just be a matter of running down to the notary's office and signing one, which, just is a matter of scheduling a day or two out, then it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks to process if you're back in the States or Canada. And so we need to know, your agent needs to know so that they can arrange it in advance, because it's not something that you can do last minute. Then we're going to schedule a closing. Here's the weird things about trying to schedule closing. In this process, it's out of everybody's hands as to when the permit is going to come back from the foreign ministry. And so all the due diligence is done ahead of time, and then the permit gets applied for. So literally, when the permit comes in, the notary needs a day to get the paperwork together, and you guys can close the following day. But realistically, in a lot of these transactions, either the buyers, the sellers, or both parties live in a foreign country, and so those parties need time to be able to make travel arrangements. And I can't say for 100% that we can close on Tuesday the 15th at noon until the bank's holding the permit. So it's wait, and then, okay, we can close now. All right, so closings usually take between 30 and 60 days, or as they're stipulated in the terms of the agreement. And again, closing dates can, a speculative closing date can be proposed, but nothing can be concrete until that that permit is back, and we know that we can, everybody can buy plane tickets safely without having to worry about changing plans. On closing day, again, all parties on the trust or in the deed have to be physically present or represented by a power of attorney, and that's buyers and sellers both. The new deed is going to be gone through and explained to the buyer and seller. That's either done by the notary's office or by your agent. Depends on the notary office, what they prefer. Parties sign, and then your monies are distributed from escrow. And depending on the receiving bank, those funds can take 1 to 3 days to actually hit your bank account. So on the day of closing, once things are signed, we notify the escrow agency. They release the funds. And when they release the funds, they give us an FDIC confirmation number. So that's a solid confirmation number that says your funds have been sent. And then it's just a matter of time, depending on where your bank is and if it's got any intermediary banks that your bank requires it go through before it get to you. It can be very quick, or sometimes it can be a couple of days. But your money is on its way. Then at the very end, we're going to remit an official receipt. Now remember, an official receipt in Mexico is called a factura for our services, which you can use as a possible ISR deduction. Okay, we'll talk about ISR in just a minute. But our commissions are deductible. So in the sales process, we talked about escrow accounts. Escrow accounts are important because they protect both parties. They protect both the seller and the buyer. The buyer can confidently put money in and show their good faith and have their funds available and ready prior to closing, full funds available and ready for closing, without risk of paying the seller directly before the transactions actually occurred. And the seller is protected because the buyer is committing funds that aren't refundable unless it's according to the terms in the offer to purchase, which typically says that those funds aren't refundable unless for some reason title can't be transferred. So both parties get protected. You've taken your property off the market, and this buyer has made a commitment that they can't back out on. These accounts, this is really important, there are no licensed bonded escrow agencies in Mexico at this time. Okay, so our escrow accounts that we open are in the United States. Our properties are listed in U.S. dollars anyway. They get opened in the States by licensed, insured, bonded escrow agencies. If you place your money with a notary or with an attorney in Mexico, the legal framework doesn't exist with the insurance policies attached to that money as it would if you were placing it in an escrow account with an escrowed attorney, escrowed with an attorney in the States or in Canada. It just doesn't work that way. And so be aware and make sure that your agent is using a licensed bonded escrow agency. Let's see. Oh, and then I guess I just forgot that last point, letter of disbursement. Basically, sellers are going to sign a letter of disbursement just prior to closing, and it says, okay, I've got full funds in escrow for this purchase, and I'm going to end up receiving this amount. We can be paid out of escrow, so my real estate agent receives this amount. And here's a good point. We happen to work with some notaries who will take payment out of escrow. Escrow is not a Mexican deal. A lot of notaries aren't familiar with it. Some are. And so some will agree to be paid out of escrow. Most, however, want fees paid in advance. And if that's the case, remember, if you have ISR or something pending, then you might need to pay that prior to closing. So that's something that you need to know and go over with your agent just to see if that's feasible. Okay, another point about the sales process. Are you selling a property that includes contents? The biggest point of this slide is actually the second point, is that the registered sale price of the property will be the actual sale price of the property. The days of underreporting sale values in Mexico are gone. If you aren't aware, it used to be sort of a common thing. It never was legal. It was always tax fraud, but it was sort of a common thing where maybe you only paid $300,000 for a property, but you only listed it at $100,000. That is no longer possible. Anti-money laundering laws require notaries and agencies to report what's being paid, even documented with the bank transfers. So this is no longer possible, okay? So if you pay $300,000 for a property, it's going to get recorded at $300,000 in the deed. This exception to this is these properties that are being sold with a bunch of furniture. Maybe you've got a house full of furniture in it and it's being sold fully furnished. Well, neither the buyer nor the seller have any fiscal obligation, legal and fiscal obligation, to pay capital gains and acquisition taxes by each party respectively on used furniture. Okay, so typically what will happen, as we mentioned in the offer to purchase, it might say I'm paying $310,000 for Mr. and Mrs. Smith's condo. $10,000 is to be appointed toward the existing furnishings, which are the following, and the inventory comes in. And $300,000 goes for the actual purchase of the condo, and that is the price to be registered in the new deed. And so it ends up becoming two separate transactions. And that is just fine and completely legal. But that's the only exception to that rule. Okay, you as a seller, what are you looking at as far as costs associated with selling? Well, typically in most transactions, a buyer is responsible for all closing costs with the exception of the following, which I'm going to list below. Okay? Buyers, since they pay the closing costs, they pay the notary fees. Typically, they select the notary, and we have several notaries that we recommend, and depending on certain circumstances, we might go one route or another. If the property is held in a trust, in a fideicomiso, then the buyer has the option to assume your trust or have you cancel that trust, and they're going to open it in another bank. So that might also dictate what fees you have at closing. Here are the list of fees that are typically paid by sellers at closing. One is the ISR tax. Again, this is the capital gains tax. We work to minimize your ISR exposure. This is a huge benefit to working with a real estate professional. We're going to talk about ISR in a minute. Trust cancellation fee, if applicable. If you own your property in a trust, and again, the buyer is going to put that property into a new trust, or they're a Mexican buyer or a Mexican corporation and they need to cancel it because they don't need it, then you might have a trust cancellation fee from your bank. Banks typically charge those, and they vary depending on the bank. The next point is a change of address fee. This doesn't happen very often, but what this is when the municipality has changed the address system from the time you purchase. So maybe your deed says you live at 123 Niños Heroes, and now this happened in Puerto Morelos a long time ago, and now the municipality came in and changed our address system to Super Manzana such and such, Manzana 2, Lot 5. Well, if that happened, then you have a deed sitting there that says it's address this, and then you have all these property tax bills and things being presented that says it's address Y. And the notary needs some type of paper to square that this is the same property that's being referenced in all this paperwork. And there is a paper from Catastro that they can issue that says properly formerly known as 123 Niños Heroes is now da-da-da-da-da. It's a very nominal fee, but it's something that it's basically an expense for you to rectify your paperwork so it's sale ready. And that's something that we check for when we do our due diligence at the very beginning, and something that you'll be aware of needing to correct if that should happen at the time of sale. And then if for some reason due diligence turns up any other expense related to you cleaning up your paperwork, a construction registration issue or something like that, then those would obviously be your expenses, because your duty as the seller is to bring clean, transferable paperwork to the sale. So the notary might have a little bit of cleanup work to do. If he does, then that would be at your expense. And then real estate commission. Obviously, your agency is going to be paid to at the time of closing. We don't get paid unless your deal closes. What is ISR? Okay, as we start to talk about ISR, I'm limiting the scope of this conversation to privately held residential properties. So if you have a Mexican corporation and you own property, then your property is assessed ISR in a completely different manner. You still pay it, but basically, you know, for corporations, you're selling a corporate asset, and that just is one more line of income in your whole profit loss picture that you're taxed upon. Okay? ISR, when it's a privately held residential property, then in that case the ISR is due at closing. And what's a residential property? Well, Mexican law defines residential properties as privately held property where the land does not exceed 3 times the amount of construction. For most people, this is not an issue. We live on small lots in Puerto Morelos or wherever you're from. If you happen to be on a big spread like a hacienda, then this might be an issue for you. What they do in those circumstances is they take the land, the proportional amount of land allowed, and the house, and they call that the residence, and that's taxed under the ISR laws that we're going to talk about, and the rest of it is taxed outside of that residential tax law. So if you're sitting on a big piece of land, it's something to consider. For most of us, I don't think it's going to be an issue. ISR. ISR actually means Impuesto sobre la Renta, and that is the name of the income tax in Mexico. And that's important to realize, because if you're an employee and you earn income, you pay ISR, your income tax. And this is why I hesitate to call it a capital gains tax, because it's really misleading. The profits from your sale of a property are not governed by a separate capital gains tax law or taxed at a different capital gains tax rate, okay, as they often are in other countries. And it also can't be deferred, at least as it can in the U.S. I don't know about the Canadian tax law, but in the U.S. we can reinvest that money within a short period of time after a sale and defer the taxes on it. Well, in Mexico, that's not possible. So because of all of those things, I hesitate to call it a capital gains tax law, because it implies a lot of things that aren't necessarily true in this circumstance. It is an income, and it is taxed on the gain, okay? So it is based on gain, which is why they call it a capital gains tax law. But I prefer to use ISR because I don't want the two concepts mixed. The gain that's realized when you sell your property is treated as personal income and subject to income tax law, okay? So same rates, same law, same tax. It's not a different tax, it's not a different rate, and it can't be rolled into something else. So that is what the ISR is. Well, what's the rates? The rates can go anywhere up to 35%, depending on that amount of gain, which is considered income in the transaction. Most property sales, are going to fall anywhere between usually the 21 to 35% range. Well, how is this calculated? This is not necessarily intended to be a walkthrough so that you can calculate this. I'm going to tell you that notaries use a computer to do this very complicated calculation. If you are interested in a deep in the woods sort of walk through step-by-step calculation of ISR, then go to my blog. Go to puertomorelosblog.com. There's a search box, and in that search box type in ISR. There's just a couple articles that come up, and one of those is an article where I call it Deep in the Woods article, where in I think the first paragraph, walk you through a couple of examples. Really, it's just an academic exercise, because the notary, your realtor is going to get you an ISR estimate when you list. But I think it's helpful to understand how at least that estimate is done, and that's what this intends to do. So the income that you realize from your sale is based on the gain, okay? And so how do they determine your gain? Well, they take the recorded new sale price and they subtract it from the adjusted original purchase price, and that's your gain or your income as the result of the sale. So what's a new recorded sale price? Well, remember, that's the value that's going to be recorded in the deed at the time your property is sold. So if you're Mr. and Mrs. Smith and you're selling that $300,000 condominium, maybe the sellers are paying $310,000 because they're paying $10,000 for contents, but we're recording the property at $300,000 because that is the recorded value of the property. We're not recording it, under-recording it. Remember, we can't do that. So it's being recorded at $300,000. That's your new recorded sale price. That's the new sale price for the property. Your original purchase price gets adjusted, and that's why it's called the adjusted original purchase price. Maybe when you bought that condo, you paid $200,000 for it, okay? Well, it depends on how long ago you bought it, but let's say I paid $200,000 for something in 1980. Certainly $200,000 in 1980 was worth a lot more money than $200,000 is in 2014, and that's because of inflation. So Mexico is very fair about this. They have a scheduled rate of inflation that every notary uses, and depending on when you bought, they're going to adjust that value up for inflation. So you're comparing the new recorded sales price in 2014 dollars to the original purchase price in 2014 dollars. That's a really fair thing to do because it was worth a lot. You know, that money was worth a lot more back then. Now, if you've recently purchased your condo, then this is going to make a very marginal difference because there hasn't really been that much time for a big difference in inflation. But if you owned a property for a long time, that makes a difference. Now, note, they use the value that was recorded in your escritura when you bought. So if you under-recorded the value that you purchased, let's say you paid $300,000 for something and you only recorded $100,000, you can't go back and tap on the notary's door and say, hey, notary, you know, I messed up, I committed tax fraud, and now I need you to fix it. There's no going back. They have to use that recorded value, which is another reason why under-reporting the value of a property is not a good idea, okay, because it sets you up for a big capital gain. The other thing that happens after it gets adjusted for inflation is that your original purchase price is split into something for land and something for construction. Typically, it's 20% land, 80% construction, unless it was structured otherwise at the time of sale. And the construction value is depreciated, so it gets increased for inflation and then decreased. The construction portion gets decreased for depreciation because Mexican law says that, you know what, brand new construction is worth more than construction that's 30 years old because construction only has a 80-year lifespan, 50-year lifespan, whatever it is that they consider it. And so if it's 50 or 60 years old, it's basically almost at the end of its life, and it's not worth the same as brand new construction, so it gets depreciated. So those get worked into the equation, and that becomes your adjusted original purchase price. And that is subtracted from the new recorded sale price, and that gives you your gain. Now, there are some deductions that can be worked into that equation too. You can deduct capital improvements that are made to your property. Now, capital improvements are something that actually improve the value of your property. If you fix a leaky sink, that's maintenance. That's not a capital improvement. But if you do, add an addition, if you put in granite countertops, if you do things that actually improve the value of your property, then save those facturas, and those can be used as tax deductions against any gain. Your notary fees, rights, which are called derechos, and taxes that you paid at the time of purchase can be deducted, as well as any realtor fees that you paid at the time of purchase or at the time of sale of your property. So again, remember that Mayan Riviera Properties is going to give you a factura, and we can do that because we're a professional sale agency. We can give you a factura, and our fees are tax deductible. Now, that all being said, remember that according to Mexican law, for an expense to be deductible, it has to be in a factura, and that factura needs to be in your name and RFC. What does that mean? That means property owners, get your visas so that you can get your RFCs so that your capital improvements in your property can be done or can be justified with a factura in your name, and you'll be able to use those items as a tax deduction. Okay? If I still have to give you a factura, but it's not going to be with your RFC because you don't have one at the time of sale, and then you don't get to deduct my commission. So go ahead and get that done. Your RFC can be solicited online. It's free. Just get your visa and get it done. So that is how it works. When we talk about ISR, it's a big complicated topic and I try to simplify it. The other thing I want to tell you is don't stress about it. Go into an agency, get it assessed, and work with a professional that's going to make it as you know, we're going to try to maximize your deductions and get you the best deal possible. Okay. We are not magicians. We can't make it disappear, but we can try to make it in the best scenario possible. People ask, well, can I exempt because it's a primary residence or something like that? The answer is maybe. Okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be a primary residence in the sense of, well, actually for a foreigner it ends up being a primary residence, but for a Mexican national it doesn't necessarily have to be. We're going to walk through this flow chart, and at the end I think it'll make more sense as to whether you might qualify for some sort of exemption. Again, this is something that you can go over with your agent when you list. Okay. First thing to know, ISR, remember, it's an individual income tax. So every seller is assessed through this flow chart individually. So if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are selling a condo and they're getting $300,000, the law assumes that $150,000 is going to Mr. Smith and $150,000 is going to Mrs. Smith. And now we've got Mr. Smith over here on the left with $150,000, Mrs. Smith over here on the right with another $150,000, and each one of them have to walk themselves through this flow chart to see if, as individuals, not together, as individuals, they meet the qualifications for their individual tax exemptions. Okay? So let's take Mr. Smith. All right? Mr. Smith, are you a citizen of Mexico? And if he says yes, then he's going to jump right over here. All right? For our purposes, I think most of us are foreigners that are in on this workshop, so we're going to say no. Then he has to answer the question, do you have physical residency in Mexico? Now, if you don't know what the fiscal residency, not fiscal, it's fiscal. If you don't know what fiscal residency requirements are in Mexico, we're going to talk about them in the next slide, okay? But if no, you don't meet fiscal residency requirements, then you have no exemption, okay? If you do meet fiscal residency requirements, then you can move over here. And you can ask yourselves, have I exempted any other property in the last 5 calendar years? Okay. If the answer is yes, then you don't get to qualify for any kind of exemption because you've already gotten 1 per 5 calendar years and that's all you're allowed. If your answer is no, that you haven't exempted, then you move down to this box. And it says, does the income received from the sale of this owner exceed 700,000 UDs? UDs, nobody's ever heard of them. I hadn't either until I started studying real estate in Mexico. It's it's not really a currency, but it is a monetary value. Long story short, let's stick to what we're familiar with. 700,000 UDs is about 3.5 million pesos. Okay, so Mr. Smith says, well, according to this sale, I'm receiving $150,000 in income because I receive half of the total proceeds, and that is less than 750, or sorry, it is less than 3.5 million pesos. So let me answer the question for myself. Does the income I received, $150,000 from the sale by myself, me, exceed 3.5 million pesos? No, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't exceed. So I do qualify for a partial exemption. Now, note that the ISR exemption law changed in September of 2013. So you can no longer, prior to September 2013, you could exempt an entire sale. There was no threshold of 3.5 million pesos, okay? Now there is, so it's a partial exemption. But, so the partial exemption is applied, okay? It is applied, and in this case, no ISR is due. He doesn't owe anything because it's under the 700,000 or the 3.5 million peso threshold. Okay. Now, if Mr. Smith had been receiving 4 million pesos in this sale, that was his portion of the proceeds, then it does exceed this threshold, and he would be up here. And yes, and the partial exemption is still applied, and the portion that exceeds that 3.5 million pesos is subject to the ISR tax. The portion that's under that, the first 3.5 million pesos, are not. So basically, he'd only be taxed on the 500,000 pesos if he were earning 4 million pesos. The 500,000 pesos that exceed the threshold. That is what the ISR tax would be assessed on, and it's also, you can still use deductions. They get prorated as well, and you can use that prorated portion of deductions toward any amount that you have that exceeds that threshold. Okay? That's how the ISR exemption works. Now, the big question for a lot of us is, well, am I a fiscal resident of Mexico? So here's what I'm going to tell you about fiscal residency in Mexico. The first thing I'm going to tell you in this slide is what the law says. And then I'm going to tell you how notaries apply that law, because there's what the law says, and then there's the portion of how it's practically applied. Okay? Fiscal residency. First of all, it's listed in Law CFF 9. If you want to go see the original translation, this is a translation of it here. Fiscal residency is when persons have established their primary residence in Mexico. All right? So if you're a foreigner and you have established your primary residence in Mexico, then you have fiscal residency. And the spirit of that sentence says that you own one house and it's in Mexico and you live there full time. Okay? If you're a person, if you're a foreigner, when this says persons, because it's under foreigners law, so it's talking about foreigners. If you're a foreigner that has residences in multiple countries, okay, let's say you have one in Mexico and one in Canada, Mexico is considered your primary residence when your vital center of interests are located in Mexico. Well, what's vital center of interest? It says it's one of two things. When 50% or more of total income is attained by you within a calendar year from Mexican sources, or when Mexico is the principal center of your professional activities. Okay? So if you live in multiple places, then they decide that Mexico is your vital center of interest when you meet one of those two criteria. If you live here full time, the law says that Mexico is your primary residence. Okay? Now this is where the rubber meets the road. This is how SAT, which is the tax authority in Mexico, tells notaries that they can qualify people under two methods for fiscal residency. Method one is that you as an individual declare in front of the notary that you meet the conditions of fiscal residency. I hereby declare that I meet the requirements of fiscal residency. You provide an address where you can receive notifications other than the home that you're selling. That's because if SAT wants to review your file and they decide that you don't meet those requirements, they're going to notify you and say, hey, you might owe some taxes in this particular situation. And then it says you can provide your CORP or RFC. Notice it doesn't say RFC and CORP. Okay, this is interesting because most notaries require the RFC. It's kind of an interesting point, but the website actually says they require the RFC or CORP. Okay, that's method one. Method two is you can skip all of that. If you apply for there's a certificate you can get of fiscal residency with SAT. And so if you have that certificate, you could also present that. Most people don't have that certificate, and so they end up using method one. And when notaries are using method one, typically they want you to present your permanent residency visa, utility bills in your name as well as another address, and then your RFC. Okay? So remember, it's ultimately the notary who's going to say what is required in the transaction for him to apply the law. And it doesn't always mean that it's going to, he might supersede the requirements of the law. Okay? And in this case, if you request your RFC, then you know it's free and you can get it, but technically you could have just done it with your CORP. But that ends up being what most notaries require in order for you to meet that, for them to feel comfortable to go ahead and apply any partial exemption that might exist under method one. Okay, to wrap up, I want to provide some tips for successfully selling. Okay, number one, our market is doing better. Okay, it's recovering well. It's not gangbusters. It's not what I would call fantastic, but it's doing well. We still have a huge backlog of inventory to work through, and because of that, your property is probably competing with lots of other properties on the market. And because of that, you need to price. It's still a buyer's market, and you need to price your property at the most aggressive price possible, even if that leaves little room for negotiation. If you have $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 of wiggle room in your sale price, lower it. Okay, I can much more easily sell and would rather sell a property where the people are pretty firm on the sale price, maybe a few $1,000s for the sake of negotiation, than try to sell one that there's a bunch of wiggle room on. Okay, timing. Timing in our market, now I don't know about other areas, it's a good thing to ask your realtor if you're interested in other areas. Timing is helpful in our area. We have a high season. It goes from Christmas through Easter. So ideally, the time to list is right now in November. Remember, the listing process takes a little while to get through all that that information and that review process, okay, before your property gets on the market. So doing it now is a good thing. It gets your property on the market. You want it up and on, by mid-December, and by doing that, you're going to have the maximum exposure for your property. Okay, there is some activity during the off season, but it's quite often, not always, but quite often, buyers that saw things in the high season went back, got their ducks in a row, and came back to purchase something. So clearly, there isn't a bad time to list. There's buyers all year round. But for maximum exposure, it's great to get it on the market before high season. That third point, if you have an item or a piece of furniture that you cannot part with, particularly if it makes the house, if it's a key piece in the house, then remove it. The buyer will never know it wasn't there. Okay, it was ever there. Remove it before you put the property on the market, because if you have some key, like maybe you had a table custom made for your dining room that fits perfectly, or you have some key art piece that just defines the entire downstairs of your home, and a buyer sees it, they can't imagine that house without that really custom piece. It really leaves a big hole in their mind as to the ambiance that's created in that house without it, and you can bet they're going to put it in the offer, okay? And now you are at jeopardy of not selling your place because you don't want to part with something that you could have taken off the wall and and replaced it with something that the buyer would have never seen. So don't make it an issue. If it's something, particularly if it's a statement piece, take it down, keep it, enjoy it, and let's not make it an issue with the sale. Another thing, particularly in our area, is to maintain your property in good condition. Keep it sparkling clean and move-in ready, okay? People do look for fixer-uppers here, but they look for them at a big discount, because remember, the majority of buyers are foreign buyers, and they don't have the expertise. They're just moving down. They're trying to get things started. They don't want a headache with a bunch of fix-it-uppers, a fixer-upper. They might not speak the language very well at first, and so they're not looking for something that's going to need a whole bunch of work, okay? And if they are, then the price is going to be deeply discounted, because they know they're in a small pool of buyers that are willing and able to take the time that it takes to remodel something. So unless you want to take a big hit on price, really get what you have looking its best, okay? Next to final point, declutter if necessary. This hits home for me because I'm a Mexican folk art collector. Declutter it. It makes rooms feel cramped and small. In our area, we have we live in a tropical climate with a lot of humidity. And if you have a lot of overstuffed furniture and heavy curtains and all that type of stuff, it can make it smell kind of musty inside, which isn't a good thing either. Clean it up, depersonalize it. There's lots of articles. There's lots of articles you can read about staging. Go ahead and get that house ready to sell. And the last thing is that if you own a lot, if you own an empty land, and there's not a way for owners or buyers to easily define your property boundaries, then keep the lots trimmed. Okay, that always helps, regardless of whether you can see the boundary lines or not. And do something to clearly demarcate your property boundaries. If you need to, you can call a cataster out, and they'll come in and they'll actually do a survey and put in corner posts at each of your corners. But there needs to be a way for a buyer to see the size of your lot. With that, I want to thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. This is our contact information. Our website is MayanRivieraProperties.com. My blog is PortoMorelosBlog.com. My direct email is amber@MayanRivieraProperties.com, or you can send it to the general sales email. Either one will get a hold of us, sales@MayanRivieraProperties.com. And then we have two phone numbers that ring us at the office. One is a United States number, the other is a Mexican number, and we're happy to talk to you. So with that, I certainly hope you enjoyed the workshop. I hope that you learned something. I wish you the very best of luck in selling your Mexican property. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me through any of these mediums, and I'm happy to either assist you in listing or to refer you to a realtor if I'm able to in your area that I've worked with and can recommend. So thank you so much. Have a great night, and enjoy the selling process. Best of luck to you. Bye-bye.